At the end of last year, I spoke with the co-founder of cyber security firm Internet 2.0, Rob Potter, about his plans to establish an office in Ukraine and train Ukrainian military veterans to ward off online attacks. With new reports of Russian cyber intelligence being used to target missile strikes and the war approaching its one-year mark, Rob joins me live now from Kiev. Rob Potter, thanks for your time. With Russia using that intelligence to zero in the missile attacks, what is Ukraine doing to try and combat that right now?
So right now, Ukraine's going through the process of fortifying a lot of its open source exposure. So if you think of everything you post to the internet about how you move around and where you go to work and things like that, that becomes very useful to an adversary during wartime. And now that Ukraine is enduring a significant amount of missile attacks, we're seeing the Russians now using cyber means and cyber threat intelligence to figure out the level of activity of buildings. So what they're doing there is then trying to figure out how many people are at work, what systems are operational, how many people, whether or not the systems are being upgraded or restored, so that they can use their limited missile stocks as well as they possibly can. So what we're doing with the Ukrainians is trying to train a generation of additional capacity into the Ukrainian defensive capabilities, so that they're in a position to detect and respond to this sort of intelligence scraping activity.
And Rob, with Russian cyber threats, we've heard about this well before Ukraine, their capacity. How have the Ukrainians held up in the face of the Russian onslaught via the cyber route as opposed to the physical one?
I mean, everyone expected that Russia would subject Ukraine to significant cyber attacks early in the war, but Russia jumped the gun on a lot of preparatory military activity, like long-term bombing campaigns on military and critical infrastructure targets. They went straight at Kiev using their tanks. So a lot of the area where you would see how we expected a cyber war to emerge didn't happen because of the Russian underestimation of Ukraine's capability. But since the war has settled into more of a long-term phase, what we've been seeing is the Russians getting more active in the cyber domain and using it primarily as a targeting and intelligence capability. Now, they're obviously trying to knock off Ukraine's power grid, and they've had some success doing that in the past. In 2014, they successfully knocked off part of Ukraine's power grid with the NotPetya cyber attack. But since then, Ukraine's obviously had plenty of time to get ready to make sure that the light on and off situation is something that they don't face. But now Russia's using cyber means as part of an intelligence and targeting platform to attack Ukraine.
Rob, what's the situation like now in Kiev to live there as you are right now? And what impact is winter having on the conflict?
Well, right now it's strangely warm in Kiev. It's above freezing for most of the day, which means that the drain on power supplies in the city isn't as bad as people were forecasting if Ukraine had a really cold winter. So the power situation is pretty normal. Most people have electricity, and life is more or less back to normal for the majority of the citizens of the city. So, for example, people go to lunch, but then part of the normalcy of this place is that when there is a missile strike or a raid by the Russians, the alarms go off, people go down to the bomb shelters, and then when those sirens go off, they go back to normal life. So normal life persists in ways you wouldn't necessarily anticipate here. On the ground, that's having an impact on Ukraine's ability to launch offensive military operations. So you saw that they took Kherson back towards the end of last year. But now, because we're in winter, but we're not quite to the point where the ground is frozen, that's having an impact on Ukraine's ability to use its tanks, because at the moment everything is quite muddy, and that restricts the ability of the Ukrainians to launch widespread offensive operations. And it's having some positive impact to the Russians, giving them time to prepare for their springtime anticipated offensive.
Australia provided Bushmasters. They had a significant impact. Some discussion about whether we should supply some of the old tanks that our military have in stock. What would you suggest about that? Would that be an appropriate move by the government as well?
Yeah, I think so. But when you look at the Ukrainian armed forces, as we have for the last few months, we're seeing increasingly large amounts of Western equipment that they're using. So we're starting to see mine-resistant vehicles, Western small arms, and they're slowly transforming into essentially like a NATO quality military and ditching some of that old Russian equipment, some of which is very old and hard to maintain, particularly since, for most of us, the war started in February, but for Ukraine, the war started in 2014 when Putin invaded Crimea. So some of the Ukrainian military platforms have been in the field for a very long period of time, so they need to be refreshed. So what we're seeing now is that slowly over time, people are sending more and more modern military equipment to the Ukrainian military. You're seeing Leopard tanks getting ready to be deployed here. You've seen the Americans send Bradley fighting vehicles here. And now the push is for main battle tanks. And that's something the UK has already done. Poland is likely to do that soon. And you're seeing these latest generation tanks coming to the front line. I think given that Australia is going through a refresh of its tank fleet at the moment, it would make sense for some of our tanks to be sent up here since we're probably not going to be using them anymore.
Rob, finally, before you go, what's the mood like among Ukrainians? Is there a sense of optimism that they will win this war?
Absolutely. The Ukrainian population is incredibly united. You get a sense of that basically everywhere you go in the country. It's a country that has kind of come together and rallied around a very charismatic president. Zelensky's everywhere in this country. He's hugely popular, and the average Ukrainian on the street is determined to win. Even people who are, would have thought of themselves as not necessarily as Ukrainian as some other people in the country, when you talk to them, the treatment of the population in the occupied areas by the Russians has fundamentally changed, whether or not they would want to live under Russian occupation. They're looking at the war crimes from the Russian occupying forces and going, this isn't for me, I'm going to support the Ukrainian government.
Rob Potter, co-founder of Internet 2.0 and doing some great work in Ukraine. I appreciate your time and your insights there in the early hours in Kiev. Thanks.